Okay. Well, welcome back, folks. We are on our last presentation to the history of the Ozarks. Next week, we'll be starting a new series that I am so excited about. I mean, I just can't hardly wait to get going on it. It's going to be about the history of the music of the 50s and 60s that a lot of us grew up listening to. I kind of call it the soundtrack of our youth. And I know a few of you are older than me, but still yet I know from watching my fellow residents here and during happy hour, when we have people in singing those songs from the 50s and 60s, they just get smiles on their faces. So I think we're just going to have a really good time. Today, we're going to talk about something that's not quite so fun, okay? We've been talking about the Great Depression. And one of the effects of the Great Depression was a rise in criminal activity. So we're going to talk about something called the public enemy era. And I'm going to kind of put myself hidden away, so I'm just talking now. The public enemy era was brought about by a rise in crime due to the Great Depression. A lot of people were out of work. They didn't have any way to make any money. And as a result, a lot of people turned to criminal activity. Most of it, they did purely to survive, but there were some of those that really did it for a lot more than that. It spawned a lot of very famous incidents in American history, spawned a lot of very infamous people like John Dillinger and all. But the Ozarks had their own little group, and it had an incident which, at least in the Ozarks, at least in the Springfield area, is one of the most infamous events in the history of the Springfield area. It's called the Young Brothers Massacre. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is the Young Brothers Massacre. So let's get on a road here. Let's get on Sunshine Street coming out of Springfield to the west. And you come down here to Farm Road 115. You cross over Wilson's Creek and you come over hill, and there's kind of a little triangular thing here, and you cross over that and you go north on Farm Road 115 for a quarter of a mile or so, maybe a half a mile. And you look back over here in the distance and you see an old farmhouse. It's obviously an old farmhouse on Farm Road 148 that's been oddly modernized and renovated. And it's a beautiful home. You look at it and you think, boy, that's just such a peaceful, pleasant little farmhouse, a little cottage that someone's rebuilt. And it looks so, so peaceful. Well, folks, 90 years ago, January the 2nd, 1932, it wasn't so peaceful. That's a scene of the same farmhouse I just showed you, taken on the night of what is generally referred to as the Young Brothers Massacre, January 2nd, 1932. By the way, that photo is a really interesting photo. There was no lights out there, no electricity. The only way to get a photo was they shot magnesium flares up into the sky. And you can see it made the branches almost look like skeletal hands. And that picture has always fascinated me for that reason. So what happened? Well, on that night, January 6th, 1930, January 2nd, 1932, 6 police officers were killed by 2 farm boys in Brookline, Missouri. That is the largest number of police officers killed at any one time in American history. Now, you might say, well, what about 911? Well, that's obviously true, except I consider that more like an act of war than a criminal event. And this was a criminal event. It was done by, at least the record says it was done by 2 farm boys, Harry and Jennings Young, 2 local guys who had gained a reputation as criminals. So let's see what we can see. Now, we all know Missouri is a rugged, remote land. Still is. You can get lost in the Ozarks. You can get yourself into some places in the Ozarks and it'll be days before anybody can find you, maybe weeks, maybe months, if you really want to get lost. Well, that was an advantageous thing to a criminal. And sure enough, in the 1930s and even further back, we've had our share of criminals. After all, one of the nicknames of the Show Me State is the mother of outlaws. Jesse James, his brother Frank James, the younger brothers, Bell Star, the Dalton Gang out in Coffeyville, Kansas. And of course, we talked about the Bald Knobbers, So we've had more than our share of criminals in the past that's roamed around the Ozarks for sure. Now, what would it cause this? Why would we had this big infamous event? Well, it all got related to the Great Depression. We saw last week in 1929, the country descended into a really terrible economic situation. The stock market crashed. People lost their jobs. It was just a horrendous event. Banks were closing. People lost their money, and as you might expect, bankers became one of the most targeted people in this country as far as people being angry at, because they felt like the banks had taken their livelihood. Farms were foreclosed. They just up and left them. People resorted to whatever they could to make a living. In the Ozarks, a lot of people resorted to moonshining and other criminal events, stealing, burglaries. That gave rise to a whole new brand of outlaw that this country really had not seen before. It was called the lone wolf. And it was precipitated by things like the car, which had not been around before, the machine gun, which had been invented in World War I and had gotten out on the streets by the late 1920s, early 30s. So you had people like John Dillinger running around, robbing banks, killing people. You had Machine Gun Kelly. You had people like Bonnie and Clyde, who very much frequented the Ozarks. They didn't live here. They really didn't live anywhere once they got under criminal, tirade, because they lived in their car for about 2.5 years. And I know Donna sitting down there in Joplin is very familiar with the great shootout in Joplin with Bonnie and Clyde. And then you had Babyface Nelson. Now, for the most part, these characters didn't come around the Ozarks, with the exception of Bonnie and Clyde. But several of the real famous gangsters of the Public Enemy era had a very deep connection to the Ozarks. The result was that you had people like J. Edgar Hoover, who decided he was going to go after the public enemies. He decided he was going to declare war upon these public enemies. And so he created what was known as the Public Enemies List. And you had people like Fred Barker. You had people like Alvin Karpis on it. And of course, one of the most famous of all, Pretty Boy Floyd. Every one of these folks had a very deep connection to the Ozarks. The Barker family, there was 3 brothers and their mother. Ma Barker and her gang is what it was called. And by the way, J. Edgar Hoover tried to make Ma Barker out like she was some kind of mastermind criminal. And they said the poor old woman couldn't even organize breakfast, let alone an outlaw gang. She just, this was just kind of made up. That doesn't mean she didn't participate in the events that occurred, but she really wasn't the mastermind. By the way, the Barker gang was raised in Ash Grove, Missouri. They moved to Aurora, Missouri in their youth and finally ended up out in Webb City before they ended up out in Indian Territory. Alvin Karpis joined that gang, and although he originally hailed from Canada, he spent much of his life in and around the edges of the Ozarks. And then we had down here Pretty Boy Floyd. Pretty Boy Floyd is one of the most famous of all these gangsters, these public enemies that came out of the 1930s. Pardon me while I get something to drink here. Pretty Boy Floyd was raised out in the Cookson Hills of Oklahoma, just right across the border from Arkansas and Missouri. He was a true Ozarker. And by the way, he absolutely despised the name Pretty Boy Floyd. It was given to him by a madam at a brothel, and he just absolutely thought it was a horrible name. He preferred Chalk because he liked Choctaw beer. And that was what his friends called him, was Chalk Floyd, not Pretty Boy Floyd. There's a story goes that when he was killed and he was lying dying in the cornfield, where he was killed, that Melvin Purvis walked up and asked him, are you Pretty Boy Floyd? And he looked at him, he said, no, I'm Charles Arthur Floyd, and died. He absolutely despised the name Pretty Boy. Well, it shouldn't surprise you, given the remoteness and the ruggedness of the Ozarks, that the Ozarks and some of the surrounding area became kind of a refuge for criminals. In fact, the case, there were 4 safe cities in America during this public enemy era. These were cities that you could go to and pretty much get lost as long as you didn't break a law, as long as you paid off the authorities, as long as you did what was expected of you, and kind of keep your nose clean, they would leave you alone. One of these, of course, was Kansas City, Missouri, right here. Another one was Joplin. And finally, Hot Springs, Arkansas, all within a very short distance of each other. The other one, by the way, was Minneapolis, Minnesota. So as a result, you had a lot of gangsters visiting the Ozarks. Al Capone and Lucky Luciano frequented Hot Springs, Arkansas in particular. They also, hung around Kansas City. We know from legend that Al Capone apparently visited and vacationed quite frequently in Rockaway Beach. One of the reasons was because Hot Springs was kind of run by this guy right here, a man by the name of Oni Madden. And Oni was a displaced organized crime person from New York City who got in trouble with the mob. And rather than kill him, they sent him to Hot Springs, Arkansas to organize the mob down there. And that's what he did. And he set up all the casinos and, the assorted things that went with it. So out of all this environment, out of all this public enemy area, the remoteness, the ruggedness, the depression, sprung a family which spawned Harry and Jennings Young. Now, the family was a good family, okay? There wasn't anything wrong with the family. This is the family out in western Oklahoma. They originally were from the area between Nixa and Ozark, right around what's called the Richwood area, right around where the OTC building, if you're familiar with that area, is. And around the turn of the century, they moved out to western Oklahoma, and this is a photograph of them out there. There were 11 kids in the family. This is the mother, the father, and this is the mother here. And I'm sure that must have been one of the in-laws, one of the grandmother of all these kids here. The family actually ended up being almost like a family of 2 different groups. The older 6 kids really did not have any connections with outlaw problems at all. They were good, upstanding citizens. They all went to high school. In fact, the story is that out of these 11 kids, 10 of them graduated from high school. I don't know if you can appreciate that or not, folks, but in the turn of the century Ozarks, to graduate from high school was quite a big event, particularly if you lived in rural areas. And 10 of these 11 kids graduated from high school, according to the story. A couple of them even went to college. So, there was almost like 2 different families, because the younger kids, the younger 5, and this is 4 or 5 of them here, these 5 here, that were raised out in western Oklahoma, they were raised in a much different environment than they found out in the Ozarks. Western Oklahoma in the 1900s, early 1900s, was still Indian territory. It was the Wild West. It was the last remnants of the old Wild West. And these kids grew up in a really harsh environment socially and physically. So much so that by the 1915-16 time frame, J.D. Young, James David Young, and his wife Willa Florence Hagwood decided they were going to move back to the Ozarks, and they purchased this 90-acre piece of property over at Brookline and built their house. Now, as those younger kids grew up, the three boys, there were three boys. There was Harry, Jennings, and Paul, and Lorena and VINITA, the two sisters. Those five kids, the youngest ones, I just showed you a picture of a minute ago, grew up in a really wild environment themselves. And when they came back to the Ozarks, and the Depression started up, and they just really did not follow the norms of society. The boys in particular became known as thieves, and they just started stealing everything they could. They particularly liked to steal from the Frisco Railroad. Remember, the Frisco had its headquarters in Springfield, and it was a gigantic operation. And the trains would come in, they would park overnight with loaded boxcars, and it was very tempting for people to break into these boxcars and steal stuff. And this was something that the Young brothers became noted for. The result was in the 1920s, they were all caught and for different crimes, and they all ended up serving time in the Missouri State Penitentiary. This is Paul Young, this is Jennings Young, and this is Harry Young. He was the baby boy. You can see that Paul and Jennings looked an awful lot alike. In fact, in case a lot of people thought they were twins, they looked so much alike, but they really weren't. Paul was a couple of years older than Jennings. Jennings was about 3 or 4 years older than Harry. And you can see that this is their mugshots from the Missouri State Penitentiary that they spent time in. And folks, if you don't know anything about the Missouri State Penitentiary in the 1920s and 30s, it was a pretty rugged place. The story was, if you weren't a criminal when you went there, you sure were going to be when you got out, because it was a really hard place. It is known for a fact that Harry Young, the youngest one, met up and at least was an acquaintance of Pretty Boy Floyd, who was also serving a term in the Missouri State Penitentiary at the same time Harry was. So that will give kind of credence to a later theory that Pretty Boy Floyd was at the farmhouse. There's not a lot of evidence to, in fact, there's no evidence to prove that that was the case, but some people think it's the case. Well, Harry Young got out of prison in the spring of 1929. He came back to Missouri, and he started right back where he stopped, just stealing stuff. Everything he could get his hands on, he was stealing stuff. And he became kind of wanted again. People weren't for sure. They didn't have any evidence to arrest him, but they were pretty sure that he was back involved in crimes, burglaries and thefts and stuff. They had not really been violent up to this point. Well, on the night of June 2nd, 1929, he comes into Republic, Missouri, my old hometown, and he meets up with a young man by the name of Orville LaFollette, one of his acquaintances. And Orville's not a bad guy. In fact, he's just typical teenager, but I'm sure he was kind of impressed with Harry being an ex-con and all like this. They meet up and they decide they're going to just drive around drinking liquor, causing trouble. And so they begin driving kind of between Republic, Clever, and Billings. There's 3 towns located right near each other. And they kind of made a circle between those 3 towns. Finally, about 10 o'clock at night, this is 1929 in June, they drive down the main street of Republic. This is the main street of Republic as it would have looked about the early 1920s or so. Railroad tracks, that's the Frisco tracks running through it. And drives up and down this main street, main drag here. Now, there was a restaurant over here called Ryan's Cafe. And it so happened that it was still open. It was a Saturday night, and people would come into town, and they stayed open late, so people could, eat and visit. The town marshal happened to be in there, a man by the name of Mark Noe. Mark Noe was a hardware store owner. He was not a trained police officer. He was a night watchman. He had the title of Marshal of the Republic, but folks, he had absolutely no training whatsoever as being a police officer. All his job was to make sure that the businesses were locked up at night, and if somebody got out of hand, he was supposed to take him and put him in they had a little makeshift iron jail cell back in an alley, and put him in that jail cell until he could get a hold of the sheriff, and the sheriff could send someone down and get him. He was not a trained police officer, but he is sitting inside this cafe when someone comes in and says, "Hey, I think Harry Young is driving up and down Main Street causing some trouble." Now, Mark Noe was familiar with Harry Young, as was just about everybody in the Republic, Brookline, Springfield area. They knew who he was, and they knew that he had just gotten out of prison. Mark Noe apparently didn't think it was too bad a situation, because he gets up and goes out and kind of steps in front of the car as he's coming down the street, and Harry Young stops. Mark Noe gets up on the running board, looks in, and he says, "What are you guys doing?" Recognized Orville Follett immediately. And then he looks down and he sees a gun laying under the leg of Harry Young, which was a no-no. And he says, "Harry, I see you got a gun. I'm going to have to take you in." This is from testimony later from Orville Follett. So he gets in the car, squeezes Orville Follett over, and he gets in the car and apparently instructs him to drive to local justice of the peace's house so he can bring charges against him and put him in jail. Well, Harry Young was not going to go to jail. Now, there's a lot of rumors about Mark Noe and Harry Young having a bad relationship. How much of that is true, I can't really tell you. But there's a lot of stories that those two had run-ins before. And apparently, Harry Young decided he wasn't going to go to jail that night. So he pulls the gun out from under his leg and shoots Mark Noe. And then takes off north on Main Street. Stops again. There's a struggle ensuing. Mark Noe is apparently still alive, trying to get the gun away from him. He's reaching over LaFollette. Another gunshot rings out. LaFollette jumps out of the car and runs off into the darkness of the night. And then the car takes off north out of town. Now, by this time, there's bystanders standing on the street, wondering just exactly what's happened here, particularly all out of the cafe. And they finally decide that they better notify the sheriff of Greene County. So they call in and notify this man right here. His name is MARCEL HENDRIX. And this was his family. This was his wife, Maud, his little daughter, Maxine. And this is Merle. And this is Glenn, who, by the way, becomes a sheriff of Greene County himself later. I'm sure a lot of people out there, if you're from the Springfield area, Greene County area, you remember Glenn Hendricks very well. Well, anyway, Marcel gets up, comes to Republic. They do a search. They find LaFollette. He tells them what's happened, and they start searching for Harry Young because he is now suspected of shooting the town marshal of Republic. They don't find him that night. They eventually do find some of his clothes out on the Halltown area on Route 66. And they do find the body of Mark Noe the next day, located in an area just east of Republic, a little area called Little York, which is on M Highway today, if you're familiar with the area at all, right there at M and 60 Highway. And by the way, the man that found him was Lillard Hendricks, Marcel's brother, because they were from the same area as the Youngs. They, in fact, Glenn Hendricks's house was only a very short distance from the Youngs family. They were familiar with each other. So now Harry Young has become a wanted man for the murder of Mark Noe. Folks, that's a serious thing. Not that his other events wasn't serious, but now he's wanted for murder. And so he disappears. For 2.5 years, he disappears. Nobody can find him. Where's he gone? He's gone to Houston, Texas, where his older brothers, Jennings and Paul, and one of their sisters, Lorena, have moved. And they have gone to Houston, and at least Paul and Jennings are involved in a auto theft ring, which was one of the biggest in the United States. Stealing cars was a big deal back in these days because there was no computers. You could steal a car and you could be in 3 states over before anybody could ever figure out exactly who owned the car that was stolen. And they became very proficient at it, stealing cars in Texas, driving it to Oklahoma, selling it, stealing one in Oklahoma, driving it to Missouri, selling it, stealing one, drive to Illinois, just making a circuit around the Midwest, stealing and selling cars. And they were making good money. So Harry joins up with Jennings and Paul and Lorena and her husband down in Houston, Texas. And they decide to stay in Houston. They don't want to come back to the Ozarks because they know that Harry is a wanted man. And that's the way it stays for 2.5 years. And then in the Christmas time of 1931, at least Jennings and Harry and Lorena and her husband make the trip back to the farm to see the mother. They haven't seen their mother apparently in a couple of years. There's some other relatives living around there they wanted to see. So they sneak back to the Ozarks and come in to the Ozarks and stay at the house over the Christmas time for about 2 weeks. They keep their head down. They don't go out. If there's anything that's needed, the littlest sister, VINITA, goes in and gets it. She lives with the mother. Everybody knows VINITA. So, they kind of just keep their head down. Well, after Christmas, Jennings and Harry decide they've got to go back to Houston. They need to get out of the Ozarks. Lorena and her husband are also going back. They have come down, but they've come up to the Ozarks, by the way, in stolen vehicles, which is what they do. And so they decided they need to sell a stolen vehicle to have money. So they send the girls in, Lorena and VINITA, into Springfield to sell a stolen car. This is Lorena and this is VINITA, the 2 youngest sisters. And they go into a used car salesman on the day before New Year's Day, last day of December. And they offer to sell this car to him. It's a stolen car. Well, the guy immediately figures out it's stolen. He's figured he knows Lorena and VINITA. He knows who they are. And he's quick thinking. He says, girls, the title's a little messed up. You need to kind of take it back and get the title straightened up. Come back tomorrow and I'll buy the car from you. So they leave, go back and do what Harry and Jenny do, what they've been instructed to do. Meanwhile, the used car salesman gets on the phone and calls the chief of police in Springfield and tells him, said, hey, Lorena and VINITA Young were here trying to sell a stolen car. And I got a funny feeling Harry, at least, and Jennings may be out at the farm. And the police just kind of poo-pooed it. They just sounded, yeah, it'll be okay. They aren't going to come back. They're probably not out there. The next day, New Year's Day, the girls show back up with the car. And the guy, he can't believe it. And he's quick thinking again. He says, girls, I don't know what I was thinking of telling you to come back today. It's New Year's Day. I don't have any cash. The banks are closed. You're going to have to come back tomorrow, Saturday, the second day of January. I'll have the cash here and I will buy that car from you. And so sure enough, they leave. And sure enough, he gets on the phone. He calls the Springfield PD chief again. He alerts them and they finally figure out, well, maybe we need to be there tomorrow. So sure enough, the next day, Lorena and VINITA come back into town. They bring the mother with them. They bring Lorena's husband. He goes, gets a haircut, and they go back to the used car salesman, and there are police officers waiting for them. They arrest the girls. They take them, they arrest the mother. This is her in jail. And they alert the sheriff of Greene County. They call the sheriff of Greene County, Marshal HENDRIX, and they say, Marcel, the girls have confessed that Harry and Jennings are out at the farm. I'll let you use your imagination how they only found out that in about 10 minutes. This was a different era than it is today. And anyway, they call Marcel and they say, hey, he's out there at the farm. They're both of them are. And if you want to arrest him, we'll come out there with you. So they get a raiding party up. It ends up being 11 people go out to the farm. The sheriff of Greene County leads the posse since he's the sheriff and it's out in the county. He brings with him Wiley Mashburn, who is just a hard-edged old detective. And by the way, apparently Mashburn and the Youngs had quite a history. This is pretty much documented. He also brings with him a man by the name of OLLIE CROSSWHITE, who is another hard-edged detective. I mean, these guys are just, they're deputies and they're really tough hombres, to say the least. He also brings with him the chief of detectives of Springfield PD, Tony Oliver, who was a 25-year veteran of Springfield PD and was as tough as they come. They also bring with them a driver by the name of Charlie Hauser. Charlie had just got on the day shift because his wife had been hounding him to get off the night shift. And finally, they take with them Sid Meadows, who is a big old guy, about 6'4", weighs about 250 pounds, came from Chadwick, Missouri, and he was a tie hacker. And they convince him to become a police officer since it's the Great Depression and he can't make a living anymore cutting ties. So he becomes a police officer. These 6 men, Marcel HENDRIX, Wiley Mashburn, OLLIE CROSSWHITE, Charlie Hauser, Tony Oliver, and Sid Meadows, were all killed at that farm that evening. That is the most police officers killed at any one time in American history. And most people don't even know the story. You go outside of the Ozarks and really outside of the Springfield area, and most people are totally unaware of this story. And why there has not been a movie made about it just baffles me. But as far as I know, no one's ever made a movie. There's been talk of it, but no one's ever done it. Now, they were not the only ones. There were 5 other people. There was a couple of detectives, or pardon me, 3 detectives from the Springfield PD. This is Owen Brown, man by the name of Virgil Johnson, and this is Frank Pike. Frank Pike lived longer than any of the survivors. He lived into the 1980s, and he is the guy that probably more responsible for keeping this story alive than anybody. He gave frequent interviews, he gave magazine interviews, and he told the story and kind of kept it going. The only unfortunate thing about it is that the older he got, the more embellished the story got. And it's a little hard to distinguish what was true and what was not true from what Frank Pike told us. There was another Greene County detective by the name of deputy by the name of Ben BILYEU. Ben BILYEU was from a very well-known family in Christian County, the BILYEU family. He was there. And then, I don't have a picture of him, there was a civilian by the name of R.G. Wegman. He was the 11th man. Those 4 that I just showed you in Wegman, they survived. Wegman was just a police house groupie, I guess you'd call him. And he talked his way into going on the raid. And they said that when he got back to Springfield after the shooting, he disappeared and nobody ever heard from him again. He just totally got lost, Well, they get out to the farm, these 11 people. Now, Johnson and Pike and Owen Brown, pardon me, Johnson, Pike, and BILYEU, they kind of stay back behind the cars, which is back off the distance. The other officers, they kind of roam around looking to see if they can figure out what's going on. They walk around the house, they beat on the windows, they look in the windows, they knock on the door. It's really not a very good situation for them. They only have handguns. They have very little spare ammunition. They finally decide they're going to break into the house, and they take up positions. Meadows and Hauser get behind trees on the front yard. Oliver gets behind a tree in the front yard over here. CROSSWHITE and Owen Brown are back here. Eventually, CROSSWHITE ends up behind the sod cellar at the back of the house. And HENDRIX and MASHBURN are the ones that are going to enter into the house. And so they get here at the kitchen door, and they decide that they start breaking into the house. They break the door down. The first thing that happens is HENDRIX is shot, and he falls inside the door. MASHBURN runs in after him, and he is shot with a shotgun blast, and he is shot back about 15 foot onto a wood pile. Oliver is back over here, and he sees the whole thing going on, and he starts yelling at all the other officers, telling them, "Hey, get out! Get out of here! Start shooting! They've killed the sheriff." Well, this is Owen Brown, and this is Ollie CROSSWHITE. Brown stays here at the corner of the house on the front. CROSSWHITE runs back behind the house and gets behind this sod cellar because he gets trapped from shooting up here at this window. And then the other officers are out front. Well, Oliver is now the ranking officer, and he tells the others, he tells Johnson and BILYEU and Wegman to get back in the car and get back to Springfield and get reinforcements. So they take off and they go back to Springfield to get reinforcements. So now somebody starts shooting. There's two shooters going on. There's one from this upstairs window up here, and there's one from this downstairs window. And they start shooting at the officers out front. And the first one they shoot at is Charlie Hauser. He's the closest to the house. And Hauser is behind a tree, and he runs out of ammunition very rapidly. And they, he doesn't know what to do. And Oliver's yelling at him, and he tells him to run behind the car. Charlie Hauser peeks around the tree and gets shot right between the eyes. He's dead. So now you got 3 officers down. Next, they start shooting at Tony Oliver, and Oliver does exactly the same thing. He's out of ammunition. Pardon me, Sid Meadows. He's out of ammunition. He doesn't have, he's behind this very small tree, and he pokes his head around to see if it's clear for him to run to the car, and they shoot him right between the eyes and kill him. The guys in the house are very good shots, obviously. So that's now 4 down, 5 down, pardon me, 4 down. Now they shoot Tony Oliver. Tony Oliver, the head of the squad now, he's out of bullets, so they shoot him as he tries to get away to the car. That only leaves Ollie CROSSWHITE back behind the sod cellar. Somebody has had him pinned down from this upstairs back bedroom. And the story goes, the coroner says that someone evidently came out the kitchen door where MASHBURN and HENDRIX were, came up behind him and shot him in the back of the head with a 12-gauge shotgun. That means 6 officers are dead in about the time it told me to tell the story. Now, what happened to Owen Brown and Frank Pike, because they're still there? Well, they keep running. They start running back to Hazeltine Road, the main road in front of the house. And all the time they're running, they're being shot at, but they are able to get away. And finally, it's dark. The officers begin to show back up. More reinforcements from Springfield. They start searching the house. They go up to the house. They finally get people brave enough to get into the house, and they start searching the house. They can't find anybody. They search the premises. They search this big old barn. The next day, they have officers running around all over the place trying to find evidence. It's just a disaster. Meanwhile, they've got the rest of the Youngs arrested in Springfield, and they're trying to figure out where Harry and Jennings have gone, because they all agree that that was the only 2 that were there, was Harry and Jennings. Well, where they've gone is back to Texas, but nobody knew that for sure. So what happened was this: the next afternoon, Sunday afternoon, this man here, man by the name of J.D. Carroll, he's out tending his farm right north of Dallas, Texas. And he's got a team of mules. He's plowing the field, and his car wrecks right in front of his house. And the guys come crawling out of it, and he says, "Hey, what's happened?" And they said, "Well, we went to sleep." And he described them, said they were just horrible looking. Said they looked like they had soot all over them, which was probably, powder from shooting. And they tell him to say, "Hey, we don't want anyone to steal our car. Do you mind pulling it into your barn while we walk into Dallas and get a mechanic to come back and get the car?" And he says, "Sure." So he hooks up his mules, takes it into a barn, and doesn't think anything more about it. When night comes and he's scared because all of a sudden the boys haven't come back, he doesn't want anybody to think that he doesn't want anyone to think he's stolen their car. So he ends up calling the sheriff of the county and tells him, and the guy says, "Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. It's no big deal." Just so happens that telephone operators is listening in on all this. She goes home that night and tells her son about all the events of the day and mentions this. And the boy has been listening to KMOX radio out of St. Louis all day long. And he says, "Mom, I bet you that's the Young brothers." So he gets on the telephone and calls Mr. Carroll, gets the license plate numbers, gets the serial numbers of the guns that he found in the car, and he calls the prosecutor of Greene County. This is a 15-year-old kid. Gets over the prosecutor of Greene County, and they trace the weapons back to Oscar Young, another brother who lives away from the farm, who had nothing to do with the incident. I mean, that he had a good alibi, but he admitted they were his guns, and he had loaned them to his two brothers to go hunting while they were back. So all of a sudden, the search is headed towards Houston, Texas. So they notify the Houston PD, and they trace the boys down to a house the next day. There's a tip comes in that they're hiding in a house, and they raid the house. And the story goes that the two boys, Harry and Jennings, locked themselves in a back bathroom. And when they realized that they were going to be arrested, rather than be arrested, they committed double suicide. Now, that's the story. This is Jennings Young being hauled out. He's dead. This is Harry's hand. It's got a gunshot in it that's about 3 days old, which makes you wonder when that happened. This is Jennings in death. Now, I know that's a gruesome photo, but the reason I want to show it to you for a couple of reasons. They put this on the front page of the Springfield newspapers. And they did it for a couple of reasons, because there were so many people so angry with the Youngs for killing all these police officers that they wanted to make sure everybody knew that they were really dead. They also put it in there because they wanted people to know that, crime doesn't pay. Now, the story goes, the coroner said they died from one gunshot wound apiece. Folks, I can count bullet holes. And there's surely more than one bullet hole in this poor old guy. What happens to him? Well, they bring the bodies back to Halltown, Missouri, outside, right at the border of Greene County and Lawrence County. They identify the bodies. They take them back to Joplin, Missouri, and bury them in the Fairview Cemetery. And they're in an unmarked grave for some time, but today there's a marker on the grave, Harry and Jennings Young. Some people dispute this. Some people think they're actually buried in the family cemetery in MCCAULEY Cemetery over between Nixa and Ozark. No one knows for sure where they're buried, and I don't guess it really matters after 90 years. So what's left? Well, unfortunately, what's left is tombstones. Mark Knowles, Marcel Hendricks, Charlie Hausers, Sid Meadows, Tony Oliver, Ollie CROSSWHITE, and Wiley Mashburn. 7 police officers, counting Mark Knowles, killed by these two guys. It's one of the worst stories in American history, and one of the worst stories for sure in this area. But it's a story that needs to be remembered because it has a great significance in the events of the day. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Like I said, today, if you go back and try to find a farmhouse, it's a beautiful old farmhouse, lovely place, doesn't have any indication that there was a big shootout. So next week, we're going to start a whole brand new thing, and it's not going to be so gruesome. It's just going to be fun. We're not going to get into any gruesome stuff at all. We're just going to talk about, music of the 1950s and 60s. And, if you like that music, if you love hearing the stories about the singers and the bands and the songs, if you like listening to the music, if you like watching it, folks, I've got over 300 videos downloaded of all these old singers singing these songs for the most part. And some of it, it's unbelievable what's out there on the internet. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, I encourage you to come with me and join with me and put out the word to your friends, because I think you'll have a good time. So.
Well, what was
Hi, Donna.
that date about on February the 20th?